the history of ethnic attacks in the 20th century does not, begin in 1991. It goes all the way back to the 1930s, to the mid 1930s, when the Italians had invaded Ethiopia. In fact, in the 20th century, the first ethnic-based attacks by a state actor was perpetrated by the Italians. Now, because we have to, and I have to go through this briefly,
okay,
so that it will help us to understand what's happening in the country now. Okay. Because the origin of this ethnic attacks that's happening today is really the Italian rule in the mid 1930s. So what happened was, when the Italians were, were preparing to avenge their defeat in Adwa in the late 19th century. By the Ethiopians, because Mussolini, the fascist party, had come to power in Italy and was saying that it would restore the Roman Empire, it would restore the Roman prestige to the Italian state. The first thing that they said was that the shame on Italian history is their defeat in Africa by a backward. Their defeat in Ethiopia by the Ethiopians, by backward Ethiopians, and the Italians, the Italian pride. The Italian prestige has to be restored by avenging that defeat in Adwa. So, the first thing that the fascist party did was, it prepared to try to re-invade Ethiopia. So while they were doing this, while they were preparing this, the first thing that they did was they tried to set up. They tried to weaken Ethiopia internally. So about 2 years before they invaded Ethiopia in 1936, about 2 years before they actually invaded Ethiopia, what they did was they started doing this propaganda work in Ethiopia. And the line that they infused into the Ethiopian body politics at that point was to say that Ethiopia is an empire. Ethiopia is an Amhara empire, that it's not a genuine nation state, that it was created in the scramble for Africa by colonialists. And that this colonial rule that has been imposed by the Amharas against non-Amharas in Ethiopia has to be dismantled, because it's very backward. It's their claim was that Amharas are too backward to possess an empire. So what they said was that they would come in and liberate the non-Amhara populace from the Amhara colonizers, and they used 2 languages to do this, by the way. They actually 3 languages. So they were dropping leaflets all over at least in the countryside, especially in the areas bordering their colonial entities in the Horn of Africa. That's to say, Italy, Somaliland, and Eritrea. So they were doing this. They were dropping leaflets to this effect, which had these contents in the Tigrigna-speaking areas, and they were also dropping these these leaflets, which had the same content in the Somali-speaking areas and the Oromo-speaking areas. So this first idea that Ethiopia, that in Ethiopia there's a colonizer and there's a colonized people, was introduced by the Italians. So after doing this very intensive propaganda work for about 2 years, they invaded the country, like I said, in 1936. And they succeeded in occupying the country for 5 years. In those 5 years, there was rebellion. There was resistance by Ethiopians, mostly in the Amhara mountains, in the Amhara region, or what we call the Amhara region now. And they intensified the propaganda because they could not defeat the insurgency, the resistance that sprang up because of their invasion, because they were holding the country directly. They were able to recruit tens of thousands of people on the basis of this line, on the basis of this propaganda. That's when this idea that Amharas are distinct, are, like I said, the bad guys of history, was really introduced in Ethiopia. And after they left, after 5 years, after they were defeated 5 years later, unfortunately, what happened in the post-liberation era was that this was ignored. This was hushed up. This was everyone pretended that this had never happened. And in those 5 years, by the way, in the 5 years that the Italians had occupied the country, there was ethnic based attacks against the Amharas by non-state actors that were set up by the Italians, that were organized by the Amharas and the state itself, the Italian state itself. That's when ethnic-based attacks against the Amharas started. So this was like 80 years ago. So this should be this should be clear. So this ethnicity, this infusion of ethnicity in our politics is part of the colonial project. It's a colonial. It's a heritage of the colonial era, both in Ethiopia and in Africa. So this should be clear. So that's when first Amharas were extensively victimized on the basis of their ethnicity, because what the Italians did was really terrible. And I shouldn't call them Italians, by the way. I'm making a mistake in this regard. I should specify that they're fascist Italians, because the Italians are much more than this. We know the Roman Empire, and we know that the Italians are not defined by the fascists, by the fascists. So I would be making a mistake to say that the Italians were doing this. Anyway, so fascist Italy is really the culprit in this regard. They brought this divisive politics, this divide and rule tactic on the basis of ethnicity into Ethiopia, and because it was not tackled properly in the post-liberation era, because it was ignored. And because everyone thought that once the Italians left, their legacy of divisive politics would somehow disappear, was really a huge mistake. It should have been tackled. There should have been an accounting of what had happened in those 5 years. So I think in that regard a huge mistake was done, because what happened was those who were responsible for violence and those who were victims were forced to exist with no accounting taking place. And what happened was after about 2 decades of quiet. This is between about 1940. Ethiopia was liberated again. The Italians were expelled in 1941, and between that time and 1960, this is the European calendar. For 2 decades, there was quiet in Ethiopian politics. Nothing really happened. Nothing really happened. That was a quiet period in our history. But then there was a coup attempt in 1960, and that coup attempt, a famous coup attempt against the emperor, against the imperial regime. And after that coup attempt was defeated, a student movement sprang up. And in that student movement, this divisive politics that was introduced by the Italians was revived and revived. So actually, this attempt to hush up, this attempt to pretend that nothing really happened between Ethiopians, that the problem was between Ethiopians and Italians. That Ethiopians were all against the Italians was proved wrong, because it was just it lay dormant. And then it revived. But had it been tackled at that point, had there been a real attempt, had there been a real effort at national reconciliation, admitting that there have been some parts in the population, some parts of Ethiopians who had brought in, who had acceded, who had accepted that narrative that was introduced by the Italians. I think it would not have revived again through the student movement. That's what happened. Now it was, of course, during the student movement, it was not worded in the same manner. It was expressed by the Italians. Now it was, it had left-wing cliches. It had left-wing words. It was sweetened by left-wing politics, and it became this narrative that was introduced by the Italians became, a question of nations and nationalities. Pressure. It became, it was repackaged.
Yeah, repackaged.
In progressive words, in progressive terms, in progressive politics terms, but really the content was the same. And then the next for the next 10 years, another 10 years, it really poisoned the youth. The youth, a very activist youth at the time, I should add, very politicized. This was a period in which, hip hop, the hip hop culture is very popular now. Back then, it was politics that was popular. The youth was into politics. This was a period, not only in Ethiopia, by the way, this was a worldwide phenomenon. This was during, the anti-Vietnam movement in the US, and this was during the worldwide student activism that was prevalent in the 1960s, and the Ethiopian student movement was also part of that, in a sense. But like I said, the content of what they had to say, the prism through which that they saw Ethiopian politics was really, what their talents said. They picked up on their talents. So another decade of unrests, of this build-up of narrative. That was really what the student movement was about. There was a build-up of this narrative that pitted the Amharas as the bad guys of history. And then eventually, in the early 1970s, in 1974, revolution took place. A very sudden, unexpected revolution took place, and the imperial regime was overthrown. And out of the student movement sprang up these ethnic-based liberation movements. And for the first time after the Italians left, for the first time after 30 years after the Italians left, for the first time again, Amharas began to be attacked on the basis of their ethnicity. So this was the second time in the 20th century that Amharas were attacked on the basis of their ethnicity. But the point that we have to note here is that the state was not involved. There was the military regime at that point. So even though Amharas, ethnic attacks on the basis of their ethnicity, Amharas were being attacked on the basis of their ethnicity, the state was not responsible. In fact, the state was defending the Amharas against attack on the basis of their ethnicity, but non-state actors were attacking them on the basis of their ethnicity, and we could, and as long as the state is not concerned, is not in the picture, as long as the state is not the primary actor in any ethnic-based attack, we could not really call it genocide. We could call it a genocidal act. We could call it, a crime against humanity. But really, we could not call it a real genocidal threat, because a genocidal threat or a genocidal act could only be enacted, could only be effected by the state without the involvement of the state. No genocide could really take place. So that's one of the essential elements of what a genocide is. It's the involvement of the state. So even though Amharas were being attacked on the basis of their ethnicity ever since the imperial regime was overthrown in the early 1970s, between that period and the accession of the EPRDF, like I said, in the early 1990s for a decade and a half, for 17 years. We did not, no one said that, there was this genocidal threat against the Amharas. Yes, theoretically there was, but as far as capability was concerned, none of the insurgents that were doing this had the capability to execute, to really commit genocide against the Amharas on a massive scale, on the scale that we had seen genocide in Rwanda. So this was in the 17 years during which the military was in power during the first time, we should note that there was systemic violence against the Amhara on the basis of their ethnicity by insurgents. And this continued after the rise of the TPLF to power in 1991. So this trend continued right up to the time that the present regime, the regime that that's been headed by Abiy Ahmed, came to power. The 27 years, or about the 3 decades that the TPLF was in power. So, if you look at, the arch of history, if you look at the long arm of history, so we have these ethnic-based attacks that had taken place against the Amharas between the early 1930s up to 2000. Up to the time that the Abiy regime came to power. This, I think, in the European calendar, this was 2018.
Power in 2018.
18. Okay, because in the Ethiopian calendar it's 2000. It's 2010. So that's what comes to my mind immediately, because we have two different calendars, and since I'm living in Ethiopia, the European calendar is somewhat distant from me. So this was like 2018. So between 1936 and 2018, we should note that there has been cases, many cases, many instances in which Amharas have been attacked on the basis of their ethnicity by non-state actors, and that's an important point. And none of us had claimed, that the Amharas at that point, that even though we had recognized that this was happening, and at some point, we had recognized that the state could be involved in this, and then the nature of the problem, and that the nature of the problem will change if the state is involved. None of us were claiming that there was an immediate genocidal threat against the Amharas. We were just, especially for the past 30 years, in the time that Ethiopia was born, we concentrated on rooting out the threats by fighting ethnic politics, by fighting to end ethnic politics, because we knew that this threat of genocide had really come from ethnic politics. So we were fighting the TPLF on the basis of democratic questions. We thought that by democratizing Ethiopia, that we could somehow disengage ethnicity from politics and root out the genocidal threat. But unfortunately, what happened was, even though eventually we had successfully, TPLF had left power, had been overthrown through non-violent means. Unfortunately, what happened is, it's the same. It's part of the regime that continued. The regime was not overthrown. It was a faction within the regime that was overthrown. But are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still listening. Yes, I'm still here.
Yeah. So the system was not overthrown, but a faction of the system was thrown in 2018, and that same ethnic politics was that ethnic based, state sponsored ethnic politics was carried on. And unfortunately, it's the faction within the ruling establishment that had more grievances. That had supposedly more grievances against the Amharas that came to power. So this was the TPLF had claimed that they have grievances against the Amharas, but the Oromo, the extremist Oromo elements within the ruling party claimed that they had even more grievance against the Amharas, and it's those elements that came to power. And when that extremist element came to power, unfortunately, what happened was the state became a primary agent in the ethnic attacks that was taking place against the Amharas. Like I said, even during the rule of the TPLF, Amharas were being attacked on the basis of their ethnicity throughout the country. That was given, but the state was not the primary actor. It was not sponsoring those attacks. But when this regime came, the table turned, unfortunately, and the state became the primary agent, the primary sponsor of those attacks, especially the Oromo regional government. And I should also add, if you go to this region that we have bordering the Sudan, we have a region called a sub-region that we call Wumus. So these regional governments. These regional governments became the primary sponsors of those ethnic-based attacks, and since these are state actors, like I said, that were engaged in attacking us on the basis of our ethnicity, suddenly the whole situation changed completely. The problem changed completely. So this should be made clear. It's not only 1991. It's a longer story. It's about 80 years old, and it's part of the colonial project that was imposed on Africa by colonizing powers. I hope I have somehow made my point, Malada.
You have made